Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the layers of history, venturing not into glorious battles or majestic castles. Well, maybe we'll glimpse them, but into the gritty, less glamorous reality of daily life for the average person, dwelling somewhere between the 5th and 15th centuries in Europe. Picture this, the biting pre-dawn chill, seeping through thin walls, the earthy smell of thatch, and maybe nearby animals, the persistent itch under rough spun fabric. Forget your heated blankets, your memory foam, mattresses, your instantly available hot shower, and yes, your private bathroom. Because you, my friend, dropped right into a medieval cottage. And let's just say if survival was a game you just started on hardcore mode, you probably wouldn't last a day. Seriously. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there right now. It's always cool to see who's joining this sleepy little history corner. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, so the rooster hasn't even thought about its big debut yet, but the first hints of gray are struggling to find their way through the tiny, likely unglazed window, or perhaps just the crack in the door. Your eyelids feel heavy-crusted slightly, maybe definitely sandy. And the air, well, it's heavy too. With what you might ask a delightful bouquet of smoke from last night's dying fire, the faint tang of whatever livestock might be sheltering nearby or even under the same roof. Yep, common practice, the inescapable earthiness of damp soil and dried straw. And frankly, the distinct aroma of unwashed human beings. Because guess what? The concept of a vigorous scrubbing with perfumed soap under running water every morning simply hasn't been invented yet in your current timeline. Not by about, a few hundred years and quite a few advancements in plumbing. You peel your weary self off? Well, off what exactly varies. If you're slightly better off, maybe a straw mattress on a raised frame. More likely you're on a sack stuffed with straw leaves or rags possibly shared with several family members, all crammed together for warmth on the dirt floor. Personal space is a modern luxury you can entirely forget about. You're practically spooning Uncle Bert, whose snores sound like a startled donkey, and young Timmy just wet the general vicinity again. Privacy. The closest thing you get is the dark itself. Trying to turn over without elbowing someone in the eye is a morning negotiation tactic you quickly master. Your clothes. Hi. You probably slept in most of them, getting the basic discomforts and unsanitary realities that you've become hardened to, but that would hit a modern person like a ton of bricks. The lack of running water means water for washing. Cooking and drinking has to be fetched often from a well or river, which themselves might not be perfectly clean. So that quick face splash might involve water that's less than ideal. It's a stark reminder that every basic amenity you take for granted, every layer of comfort and health protection built into your modern life, is absent. Waking up isn't just waking up. It's entering into a constant negotiation with dirt discomfort and the looming threat of disease. It's amazing humans got out of bed at all sometimes. Makes you think twice about complaining when your shower takes a minute to get hot. So you're up. The sun isn't really, but you are. And you're already experiencing that sticky, slightly ripe feeling that only comes from sleeping in your own ambiance, without modern creature comforts. The immediate urge might be to hit the shower, but remember, that's several centuries away. Okay, so what do you do about, general bodily upkeep? Prepare yourself, because this is where your modern sensibilities might stage a full-blown revolt. Your hygiene routine is about to get severely downgraded. First off, that fresh breath you crave. You're not getting it. Teeth might be wiped with a cloth, maybe rubbed with some abrasive herbs like sage, or even a mix of ash and salt if you're trying to be fancy and brave. Dental hygiene as you understand it. Nope. Tooth decay, lost teeth, painful abscesses. Those are just parts of the fun medieval lottery. Mainstream historical fact alert, many medieval skeletons show significant wear and tooth loss, partly due to rough stone ground grains getting grit into their bread, but also simply from lack of effective cleaning. Your medieval smile. Let's just say it wouldn't be dazzling or maybe even complete. Now about washing the rest of you. Water is precious. Heating it requires effort and fuel. So the idea of filling up a large tub just for one person's leisurely soak, incredibly rare for the vast majority. Any washing you do is likely from a small basin, maybe of cool drawn water. A quick splash on the face and hands maybe. The body, not daily. Think of it less like a shower and more like tactical wiping. Using a damp cloth probably without soap. Real soap existed but wasn't widely or cheaply available to everyone, to just hit the highlights. Your armpits and other high odor areas are probably just, well, experiencing their natural state. Forget deodorant. You're going to smell like you, and everyone else smells like them. You quickly develop a high tolerance for potent human musk, which ironically might be a survival trait. It's like a competitive sport for who smells the most of the earth. You are regrettably winning. Bathing the entire body was more of an occasional event. For common folk, maybe once a week if you had access to a well, and time to heat water maybe less often. If you were near a river, perhaps a dip in warmer months, assuming the river wasn't serving double or triple duty as a latrine, and general dumping ground upstream. Towns often had public bathhouses in the earlier part of the period, relics of Roman influence, but, as mentioned before, their popularity waned due to various fears and beliefs. See, there were genuinely different ideas about how the body worked. Some medieval medical theories suggested that bathing with hot water opened up pores, making you more susceptible to airborne illnesses or bad humors entering the body. So, for some, avoiding washing wasn't just about logistics or poverty. It was seen as a way to protect yourself from disease. I mean, they weren't entirely wrong about communal baths and disease transmission, but maybe not for the reasons they thought. It's less bad humors entering pores and more, shared bath water. Let's not gloss over the toileting situation. In the countryside, this largely involves finding a suitable spot outdoors far enough from the dwelling and water source, hopefully. No designated outhouse with a seat and toilet paper. For that crucial step in your morning routine, you'll be squatting and making do with leaves, handfuls of straw, maybe smooth stones if you're lucky. This is assuming you're healthy enough to even make it outside promptly if nature calls urgently. Towns were often even worse, with cesspits that frequently overflowed human waste, running in open gutters alongside narrow streets. The phrase "mind the muck" wasn't just a friendly idiom. It was serious pedestrian navigation advice. The smell in urban areas must have been genuinely overwhelming to a modern nose. Your car freshener simply couldn't compete. Personal pest control is also a major part of medieval hygiene. Lice and fleas. Almost guaranteed residence on you and in your home. You comb your hair, yes, but less for styling and more to literally pick out nits. Clothing gets beaten or shaken out vigorously to dislodge unwanted guests. You'd wear things like linen undershirts, which could be washed more easily than outer woolen garments, but even those washes were laborious, often using harsh lye and done infrequently by modern standards. It's less about smelling springtime fresh and more about reducing the constant maddening itch of tiny biting things. Your bug spray. Another modern marvel, a quirky tidbit. Some high-status individuals like nobles or monarchs might have bathed more frequently or had access to private bathtubs, often wooden affairs lined with cloth. But even their practices might involve herbal rinses more than soap, and often centered on the social or ritual aspect of bathing, rather than what we'd call sanitation. And even they dealt with fleas. King Louis IX of France, who was pretty devout, was apparently quite fond of a bath, maybe showing that bathing wasn't universally seen as bad. But even with higher status hygiene, didn't remotely reach today's level. Imagine hosting a fancy dinner party and everyone arrives with a light layer of city grime and a few scratching guests on their person. Standards were just different. Historians still argue whether shifts in hygiene practices across the medieval period were driven more by genuine evolving understanding of health and disease limited, though it was changing religious attitudes towards the body, or simply economic and resource limitations, making consistent high-level personal cleanliness difficult for the majority. It wasn't just about being dirty for lack of trying. It was lack of resources, knowledge, and infrastructure. So your sparkling clean body and home. Not a given. They are achievements of a society built on layers of technological, scientific, and infrastructural progress. A progress you are currently time-warped away from. Your first task of the day before you even eat has just been surviving the sheer biological realities of existing without disinfectant, antiperspirant, and plumbing. Makes you appreciate municipal water treatment, huh? Okay, you've survived waking up without a shower and navigated the frankly alarming bathroom situation. Your stomach, bless its naive modern heart, is probably rumbling, expecting maybe some avocado toast or at least a bowl of cereal. Oh, you poor sweet thing. Medieval mealtime is less about culinary delights and more about caloric survival. Your daily diet is about to get profoundly, mind-numbingly boring and occasionally actively hazardous. Welcome to the medieval breakfast table. The concept of a distinct breakfast as we know it, a varied spread of different foods specifically designated for the first meal of the day, wasn't quite the same. For most people, it was simply the first consumption of the day whenever the opportunity arose after morning tasks began. And what would that consist of? Prepare for a lot of carbs. Mostly. The cornerstone of the medieval diet for the vast majority was grain. Think bread. Think a kind of thick, starchy soup or porridge called pottage, and think those two things day in, day out. Your morning meal is likely a hunk of bread, probably a heavy dark loaf made from rye barley, or maybe even a mix of grains and legumes. White bread existed, but that was a luxury for the wealthy. Yours is the brown stuff packed with bran and roughage. Perhaps good for you in theory, but visually uninspiring and likely tough. This bread is often not fresh. Baking was a communal activity or done by a baker, and bread wasn't always made daily in every household. So you might be gnawing on a loaf that's a couple of days old, potentially hard as a rock, requiring it to be soaked in a drinkable liquid to be palatable. And that liquid, probably not fresh milk unless you were upper class with immediate access and infrastructure for it. And even then, milk was seen as a food for the sick or elderly, and certainly not coffee or tea. Obviously, those are coming from elsewhere centuries from now. It's almost certainly ale. Yes, ale for breakfast. Why ale? Because water sources could be unreliable or unsafe. Water from rivers or wells could be contaminated. Boiling it took fuel and time. Ale, even weak small ale, low alcohol content, was safer because the brewing process killed off many harmful bacteria. Plus, it provided calories. So instead of a wake-up coffee, you're having a wake-up pint. This wasn't about getting drunk. It was about hydrating and nourishing yourself safely. The taste bitter yeasty, and not exactly a sparkling morning pick-me-up. Imagine sipping on warm, slightly cloudy beer before the sun is fully up, and that's your daily reality. Then there's pottage. This is the ultimate peasant comfort food. If by comfort you mean sustenance regardless of taste. It's a thick, slow-cooked mix of grain like oats, barley, or peas, vegetables like cabbage, onions, leeks, root vegetables when in season, and maybe if you were lucky or lived near a stream, you could fish in a little bit of dried or salted fish. Meat. Not for breakfast. Probably not for lunch or dinner most days either, unless it was a feast day or you were wealthy enough to keep livestock and afford slaughtering it. The pottage pot would often just sit simmering over the fire with new ingredients added daily to replenish it, meaning it might contain layers of flavors and textures developed over days or even a week. While economical, this also meant it was constantly warming, rarely reaching temperatures to truly kill everything, and definitely not being stored cool overnight. Spoiled pottage. Entirely possible, leading to a whole host of gastric distress. Your modern stomach lining is quivering at the thought. Meals are also heavily dictated by seasonality. You ate what you grew foraged or could preserve. This meant periods of relative abundance during harvest and lean times during winter and spring, sometimes called the hungry gap. Preservation methods were limited. salting meat or fish, making them incredibly salty, and requiring soaking drying fruits, pickling some vegetables, and storing roots in cool cellars if you had them. The quality wasn't always great, and mistakes in preservation could lead to food that looked fine but carried disease. Remember those recalls on packaged salads or eggs? Yeah, they didn't have those. You were your own food safety inspector, and your tools were basically looking, sniffing, and hoping for the best. Or maybe the philosophy was just, if it doesn't kill you instantly, finish it. A bit like that leftover curry that's maybe okay, but you aren't sure. Medieval edition. Mainstream historical fact. Grains, primarily wheat, barley, and rye, formed the basis of the medieval diet for almost everyone, often making up 70 to 80% of a person's caloric intake. This was supplemented by legumes, some vegetables and wild plants, with meat and fish being less frequent additions, especially for the lower classes, consumed perhaps a couple of times a week at best, often less. A quirky tidbit: fasting laws mandated by the church were a huge influence on the diet, restricting meat consumption for significant portions of the year, like Lent Fridays and other specific days. On these fasting days, dairy was often restricted too, pushing reliance onto fish, including surprising things considered fish, like beavers or porpoises in some classifications in plant-based foods. This religious calendar played a direct role in shaping when and what people ate. So, your Fish Fridays aren't just a modern cultural thing. It has very deep roots. Historians still argue whether the overall nutritional status of the average medieval peasant was adequate. While their diet was repetitive and lacked variety compared to ours, it was high in fiber, typically had enough calories if harvests were good, and protein could come from the legumes, fish, and small animals, birds if available. The concern isn't usually about getting enough calories in good years, but about the vulnerability to shortages and the constant risk of foodborne illness from poor handling and preservation. It's not that there was never any good-tasting food, but that most food most of the time was functional and bland. Think of the most unseasoned porridge you can imagine, eaten while cold wind blows through your home. So your breakfast is underway: a hard hunk of bread, soaking in weak ale, and a bowl of whatever has been bubbling in the pottage pot for the last few days. It's not gourmet, it's not exciting, and there's a non-zero chance it might give you stomach cramps later. But it's fuel. Fuel you desperately need for what comes next. A long, back-breaking day of physical labor. Forget brunch dates or leisurely Sunday breakfasts. Your plate, or probably just a piece of wood called a trencher, is functional, not fun. All right, that meager excuse for breakfast, probably involving questionable ale and robust, potentially days-old bread, is doing its best to settle in your stomach. But before it's had much time to get comfortable, the day isn't waiting. The weak light creeping through the doorway is the signal, the universal medieval time clock, and it screams, "Get up! There's work to be done." Your morning routine of existing unwashed and grabbing basic sustenance flows immediately into the defining feature of your medieval life: relentless, exhausting physical labor. You don't have a choice. There's no sleeping in, no calling in sick just because you're feeling a bit under the weather. The concept doesn't exist in your realm of possibilities, unless you're one of the tiny, tiny percentage born into nobility or certain merchant classes. And let's face it, if you were, this wouldn't be boring. History for sleep. It would be boring history about embroidery and feasting etiquette. Your hands are your tools, your back is your machine, and the fields are your office. If you live in a village or on a manor, your primary occupation is agriculture. Period. This isn't gardening as a hobby. This is backbreaking toil from well before sunup until the light finally gratefully fails at the end of the day. Your working hours are literally dictated by the sun, the weather, and the demands of the seasons. Spring arrives, and you are out in the fields plowing, and I don't mean on's perpetually simmering pottage. It's not delicious, but it's fuel, and you're going to need every single calorie of it, because the day from the first hint of dawn until the sun sinks back below the horizon isn't filled with commutes to comfortable offices, scrolling through social media, or leisure activities. Nope. Your existence is defined fundamentally by hard, unrelenting physical labor. You were born into a world where the vast majority of people make their living with their hands, their backs, and the sweat of their brow, coaxing sustenance directly from the earth, or crafting things slowly and meticulously from raw materials. And unless you happen to be one of the lucky and tiny percentage who are nobility wealthy merchants or high-ranking clergy, your day every day is going to be a physical grind. For most people, this means working the land. If you're a peasant, you are intrinsically tied to the rhythm of the agricultural year. This isn't just tending a little garden plot. This is fieldwork on a scale that would make your modern muscles weep just looking at it. Spring means plowing the heavy earth, scattering seeds by hand, repairing fences, clearing ditches. Summer is relentless weeding under the hot sun, scaring off pests, praying for the right amount of rain. Autumn is the crunch of harvest, cutting grain with scythes and sickles, backbreaking work that gives you permanent stoop posture just by watching it, threshing it, beating the grain to separate it from the stalks. Also turns out a fantastic workout gathering other crops. Winter means mending tools, tending animals in harsh conditions, fetching wood for fuel constantly just to stay warm. Maybe doing some indoor crafts if you're skilled and the weather's truly foul, but mostly just enduring and preparing for the cycle to start again. There's no off-season in the sense of taking a beach vacation. Any lull in one type of labor simply means shifting focus to another equally demanding task. Your workout routine is just living. Every single day is leg day, arm day, back day, all day. Tools are basic and require immense physical effort to use effectively. Plowing with a heavy wooden plow pulled by oxen or horses is slow, arduous work requiring constant strength and control. Harvesting with hand tools is backbending and repetitive, leaving you with aching muscles you never knew you had. Carrying water from the well. Several times a day hauling heavy buckets. Fetching firewood from the nearby woods. Hauling heavy logs. Every task you can think of that requires lifting, pulling, pushing, bending, or repetitive motion is done manually. Your hands inevitably become calloused and tough, constantly dirt-stained, probably cracked and dry in winter. You feel aches in places modern sedentary folk only experience after attempting to move furniture. This isn't a hobby, it's how you eat, how you survive. The connection between your physical output and your basic needs is direct and undeniable. Didn't work hard enough today? Well, there might just be less food on the table tomorrow. Or the crop might fail next season, putting everyone in danger. No sick days in this job unless you are literally unable to stand. Even if you are in a trade, perhaps a blacksmith's apprentice, a weaver, or carpenter, the labor is still intensely physical and often monotonous. Smithing involves hammering hot metal hour after hour. Weaving requires strength and stamina to operate large looms. Building is done with hand tools moving heavy stone or wood without machinery. The days are long. They start with the sun and end with the sun because there's limited artificial light. And your work is essential not just for yourself, but for the community. Peasant fields might be part of a manorial system where you work your own strip, but also work the Lord's land. Your output isn't just your own. It's part of a larger feudal contract or community responsibility. Imagine being part of a communal plowing crew, everybody working together, the pace set by the slowest ox. Your contribution essential for everyone's survival. It's teamwork medieval style, enforced by necessity and feudal obligation. Forget about things like ergonomic workstations, regular breaks mandated by HR or health and safety regulations. Injuries are common. A slip of the axe, a kicked by an animal, a sprained ankle from uneven ground. You work through minor pain. Debilitating injuries could mean you and your family starve if you can't perform your duties. Your colleagues aren't shielded by steel-toed boots or safety goggles. One slight misjudgment with a sharp tool and, well, let's just say medieval minor accidents could have major life-altering consequences. Your biggest workplace complaint today might be the office temperature or a noisy coworker. Their complaints probably involved oxen that were being particularly stubborn, or the crippling pain in their lower back that wouldn't go away. Seems like fair comparison, right? Right. Probably not. Mainstream historical fact. Upwards of 80–90% of the population in medieval Europe were rural peasants whose lives were directly tied to agricultural production and physical labor on the land, supporting the smaller population of clergy, nobility, and townspeople. A quirky tidbit related to this back-breaking labor: feudal lords could often demand boon work from their peasants. This was compulsory unpaid labor at peak times like harvest on the lords to mine his own land. Imagine being told right when your own crops need harvesting that you must go work on the boss's fields first for free. Yeah, motivational poster material right there. And it could get worse. Sometimes the lord required specific tools to be used or crops harvested in ways that were inconvenient or less efficient for the peasant, just to assert authority or tradition. Sorry you have to use the lord's slightly rusty, less sharp sickle on his field this week. Okay, fair. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant workday was actually shorter in terms of strict hours than modern workdays, counterbalanced by the much higher intensity and physical demands, lack of mechanization, and impact of seasonal variations, and church feast days, which could provide days off from typical labor, though you'd still have daily chores. Was it more intense bursts followed by lulls, or just a constant lower-grade, all-encompassing physical state? Debatable. What's not debatable is that your life was primarily spent doing hard things with your body from sun up to sundown. So your day, the moment the sun cracks the horizon, is no longer your own. It's owned by the demands of the seasons, the earth, and your immediate physical needs, and often the demands of the lord of the manor. The softness of your hands, the relative comfort of sitting or standing in one spot for long periods. The separation of work time and leisure time. These concepts are almost entirely foreign. Your leisure is recovering from work. Your recreation might be village festivals or church holidays, but they are infrequent interruptions in the ceaseless cycle of physical toil. And all this is done in the clothes you wear, pretty much constantly, clothes that aren't exactly designed for breathability, flexibility, or hygiene. That's up next on the list of medieval challenges. So you're spending your day hunched over, sweating through strenuous physical labor, hauling, lifting, chopping, digging, praying. Your muscles don't seize up entirely before dusk, and all of this is happening while encased in the clothing you own. Which, I hate to break it to you, isn't much. And it certainly isn't soft, breathable, or easily washable. Say goodbye to the concept of changing into fresh, clean clothes after a long day's work, or even just putting on something clean in the morning. Your medieval wardrobe is sparse, functional, and quite honestly, pretty uncomfortable by modern standards. For most common people, your daily attire consists of a few basic garments made primarily from what's available locally: wool and linen, maybe some hemp. Linen made from the flax plant would be used for undergarments like a chemise or undertunic worn against the skin. Wool from sheep obviously was used for outer layers like tunics, gowns, hoses a bit like tights or stockings or simple cloaks. These fabrics were hand-spun, hand-woven, and likely hadn't undergone the softening and refining processes that modern textiles benefit from. So your wool is going to be scratchy. Really scratchy, like persistently itchy scratchy. The kind of scratchy that makes you want to subtly shift and rub yourself against door frames, hoping nobody notices. Wearing wool directly against the skin wasn't uncommon, and let me tell you, your skin would have a field day protesting this treatment. It's less stylish outerwear and more felt cage that vaguely follows body contours. The clothes themselves were very simply cut to minimize waste, as fabric production was incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive. Think basic tunics, essentially fabric tubes with holes for head and arms, cinched at the waist. Trousers or hoses for men were typically two separate legs, attached to a belt or doublet. These were often made of wool. Layers were important for warmth, obviously especially in winter, as houses weren't exactly centrally heated, climate-controlled environments. But layers just meant more rough, unwashed fabric rubbing against you. Your comfortable cotton t-shirts, your stretchy synthetic activewear, your plush sweaters. These feel like sci-fi, futuristic inventions from your medieval perspective. You wear what you have, and you wear it constantly. And now we get to the washing, or rather the severe lack thereof. Your linen undergarments might get washed periodically. This involves boiling water, requires precious fuel, using harsh lye-based soap, often made from animal fat and wood ash, effective, but rough on skin and fabric, and lots of vigorous manual labor. Pounding the clothes, rubbing them, wringing them out by hand. It's not a quick trip to the washing machine and dryer. This is a full day's chore. So even the inner layer isn't being washed daily, probably more like weekly if you were diligently aiming for cleanliness and had the resources and time. Outer woolen garments. They are even harder to wash effectively and take forever to dry. They were often just beaten to get the dust out and aired. Imagine your heaviest winter coat covered in a mix of sweat, grime, smoke, smell from the fire, and general accumulated dust and dirt from the fields, and wearing it pretty much every day for months on end with minimal washing beyond a vigorous shake. That's the reality. The smell they soaked up must have been profound. You develop an involuntary sixth sense for ode to medieval peasant. The result of rarely washed rough wool and linen, rubbing against perpetually unbathed skin, especially after sweating during manual labor, prickly heat rashes, chafing, and the ever-present potential for skin infections where dirt gets into cuts or abrasions, which you constantly have from working with your hands. Plus, as we touched on earlier, your clothing is a cozy home for external parasites. Fleas loved wool. Warm holds debris, and its owner rarely removes it. Lice also made their home in hair and clothing seams. Beating your clothes wasn't just about tidying up. It was literally knocking out bugs. One quirky tidbit. Wealthy people could afford nicer fabrics and possibly more clothes, including imported silks and velvets. But even their clothes were not routinely dry cleaned or machine washed. Their cleanliness might have been more about surface appearance. Fresh linen linings changed more frequently, and masking odors with perfumes and pomanders rather than a truly clean garment underneath. So even if you saw a fancy lord, he might just be a perfumed dirt sack underneath all that silk. Slightly disappointing, isn't it? Your wardrobe is also limited. You don't have options. Maybe one set of clothes for work days and chores, which are all the days, and perhaps a slightly cleaner, perhaps better maintained version of similar garments for Sundays or religious holidays. Though even that might just be the same clothes, freshly beaten and brushed. You're not choosing an outfit based on mood or forecast beyond adding a cloak if it's really cold. You wear what you have, all the time. Fashion trends trickle down slowly, if at all, to the peasant level, driven by necessity and tradition more than aesthetics. Dyeing fabrics beyond basic browns, grays, or the natural color of the wool or flax was expensive, requiring knowledge of plants and mordants. So brighter colors were rare and highly prized for lower classes. Your typical look is various shades of dirt-adjacent brown. Nailed it. The modern aside here is vast. Think of walking into any clothing store today. Racks upon racks of cheap, varied, machine-washable garments in every color imaginable made from soft fabrics like cotton modal polyester. The ability to own dozens, even hundreds of different items of clothing washed whenever we feel like it with effective detergents in minutes. It's just so normal we don't think about it. Your medieval counterpart wouldn't just be astonished. They probably couldn't even comprehend the sheer volume and cleanliness available. You have clothes just for sleeping, and they are clean every night. Sorcery. Historians still argue whether the concept of cleanliness for clothing evolved over the Middle Ages, whether certain cultures or regions were genuinely cleaner than others. Some parts of Moorish Spain, influenced by Islamic culture, had high standards of bathing and hygiene compared to much of Northern Europe, or whether improvements were minor and unevenly distributed across class lines. What's clear is that for you as an average medieval person, laundry day is a rare, labor-intensive chore. Your clothes are an extension of the unwashed. You and that persistent itch is just a feature, not a bug. Well, maybe a bug, literally. So as you trudge through your fieldwork or your craft, the rough fabric chafes your skin. The accumulated dirt and sweat become a second skin, and the occasional sharp bite of a flea is just background noise to the ache in your back. Your clean, varied, vast modern wardrobe is but a dream you're temporarily exiled from. This isn't about style, it's about covering yourself with the cheapest, most available material and dealing with the physical consequences 24/7. And the physical consequences extend beyond just your own discomfort. The places you live and interact in are extensions of this low hygiene reality. The living spaces? Oh boy, let's get into that next. So you're perpetually itching inside your rough, rarely washed clothes after a day of intense physical work, having endured questionable food and a distinct lack of hygiene. And where do you go when the sun finally gives up the ghost and you get a reprieve from the fields home? And your medieval home for the vast majority of people is, well, let's just say it puts the rustic in rusticated architecture. It's not a place designed for leisure comfort or anything approaching modern standards of living. It's primarily shelter. Basic, sometimes barely adequate shelter. Imagine stepping inside after the cold or damp or dusty air outside. The air inside is often thick, pungent, and smoky. Why smoky? Because the typical commoner's house for a good chunk of the Middle Ages didn't have a chimney as you'd recognize it. You'd have a hearth, a fire pit in the center of the room on the dirt floor, providing heat for warmth and cooking. The smoke would simply drift up and ideally find its way out through a hole in the thatched roof, a smoke hole, or just seep through the thatch itself and any gaps in the walls. This is incredibly inefficient and fills the entire dwelling with wood smoke. Great for preserving any hanging meat, terrible for your lungs, and ensures everything you own yourself included. Smells perpetually of campfire, like you just went to an all-day barbecue but without the yummy food. The houses themselves were generally small. A simple rectangular structure, perhaps just one single room shared by the entire family. Walls might be made of wattle and daub-woven branches plastered with mud and straw, or mud bricks possibly with some timber framing. The roof is almost universally thatched. Layers of straw or reeds over wooden beams. This can be insulating and good at shedding water if well maintained, but also a fire hazard, a haven for rodents and insects, and surprisingly prone to leaks and drafts in places. Your sense of being sheltered from the elements is aspirational at best. You're technically inside, but you can often feel the wind whipping through gaps or the dampness seeping in from the ground. Think of it less like a solid structure and more like a strategically assembled collection of natural materials, hoping for the best against nature's worst. Windows, either non-existent or small unglazed openings that you might cover with wooden shutters or maybe a piece of animal skin or cloth in bad weather. Forget natural light flooding in. The interior is perpetually dim, lit only by the firelight, or perhaps a single flickering rushlight, a reed soaked in fat at night, casting dancing shadows that make mundane objects seem spooky. Try reading in here. Actually, don't try reading at all, as you probably can't, which is lucky because the light is too poor anyway. You are living in perpetual gloom illuminated intermittently by fire. It makes finding dropped items very difficult, but it's also why scary stories around the fire were so potent. Everything outside that tiny circle of light feels ominous. And about those roommates. If you thought sharing a small room with your human family was cozy, prepare yourself. It was incredibly common, especially in rural areas and during colder months, to share your dwelling with your livestock. Your cow, pigs, chickens, perhaps the oxen used for plowing. They might have their own designated section within the house, maybe separated by a low partition, or simply share the main living space with you. Why warmth? Animals generate heat, and in an unheated, poorly insulated house, any extra warmth is vital for survival in winter. Also protection, keeping valuable animals safe from rustlers or wild animals. The downside, obvious. The smells compounding that human and smoke mix the noise, the flies. The accumulation of animal waste despite best efforts. Stepping outside in the morning often involved carefully picking your way past sleeping animals or around the dung that had accumulated overnight inside before being shoveled out. Forget the concept of pets being just companions. Animals here are vital, multifunctional entities. Your housework might include mucking out part of your house. Furniture was sparse and rudimentary. Benches, perhaps a basic table, maybe just boards on trestles, a wooden chest or two. For storage, valuable is one of the few pieces of furniture that wasn't damp or on the floor, and your bed, which is likely just your straw pallet on the floor, possibly shared potentially near the warmest spot by the fire, which is also the smokiest spot. No separate bedrooms, no closets filled with clothes you remember your wardrobe situation. Everything you own is in that chest if you're lucky, or simply tucked into nooks or hanging from walls. Every activity, cooking, eating, sleeping, socializing, which might just be with the same family members you live with, working on small crafts, recovering from illness, possibly even births and deaths, happens in this single, smoky, crowded, shared space. There's no escaping to your bedroom for privacy, no quiet corner to work or relax away from everyone else. Life is lived in one concentrated area. Mainstream historical fact. For centuries, commoner homes throughout medieval Europe were overwhelmingly single-room dwellings, constructed from locally available materials, timber thatch, mud featuring an open hearth for heating and cooking, rather than a sophisticated chimney system, like those found in castles or wealthier urban homes later in the period. A quirky tidbit. Archaeological digs of medieval peasant homes often find evidence of animals living indoors. Compacted layers of organic matter like straw and dung preserved on the floor. This wasn't just theoretical, it was a practical reality confirmed by the remains they left behind, cementing the picture of just how integrated livestock was into the human dwelling. It's a slightly smelly time capsule waiting for you. Look, darling, fossilized cow pats. This was Uncle Giles' corner. Delightful. Historians still debate how widespread and effective chimney use became, and when particularly in commoner homes versus wealthier dwellings, and the regional variations in house design and building materials as house types varied significantly across medieval Europe. Some areas might have had cruck frames and thatched roofs, others mud or stone walls impacting the specifics of heat retention and smoke dispersal. But the fundamental challenge of open fires in small, crowded spaces remained a significant factor for most. So you crawl onto your straw bed trying to find a spot not too close to the fire's embers fire risk, not too far from the warmth and trying to ignore the rustling in the thatch or the occasional snort or squeak from your animal housemates. The draft finds its way in, the smoke stings your eyes, and the sheer presence of multiple bodies and animals in a confined, dim space makes it clear that peace, quiet privacy, and truly feeling clean or comfortable are concepts very distant from your medieval nightly routine. Speaking of which, the struggle for restful sleep in this environment it's a whole other layer of difficulty layered upon the rest of the day's trial. So you've woken up sticky and unwashed, navigated the bathroom situation, which was rustic, consumed your highly questionable and probably repetitive gruel and ale breakfast, and put in hours of hard physical grind, all while wearing itchy, rarely washed woolens and linen in a small, smoky house shared possibly with farm animals. Now imagine stepping outside that already low-standard environment and heading into what counts as public space. If you thought your house smelled, wait till you get a load of the street. Depending on whether you're in a village or small town, cities were a whole other level of sensory assault. The public space might be the village green, the path leading to the fields, or the narrow winding streets of a settlement. And these aren't paved, swept, or cleaned with any regularity by municipal services, because municipal services as you know them don't exist. The ground underfoot is likely just packed earth, turning to thick, sludgy mud after rain or ankle-deep dust in dry spells. This ground is shared. Shared by people walking horses and oxen, pulling carts, pigs and chickens, rooting around freely in rural areas, and yes, unfortunately, it's also where a significant amount of waste ends up. There are no garbage collection services. Household refuse, food scraps, ashes, broken bits and pieces might just be tossed out the door, accumulating in small piles that are only occasionally cleared or left for scavengers like those aforementioned free-ranging pigs to deal with. Animal waste from horses and other beasts of burden pulling carts, or just passing through falls wherever the animal happens to be, creating fragrant, slippery hazards. And human waste. Remember that outdoor expedition for your morning needs. In rural areas, you might go to a dung heap away from the house. In more crowded town settings, houses might have small cesspits, but these frequently overflowed, or the waste might simply be thrown out a window into the street below. Yes, literally tossed into the street with a shout of, "Guardy Lou! Mind the water." Imagine casually walking down your street today and having someone empty a chamber pot on your head. This was a non-zero risk in medieval towns. It puts "watch your step" in a whole new, frankly horrifying context. The cumulative smell in densely populated areas must have been a truly breathtaking symphony of rot, decay, sewage, and livestock. Wearing a subtle floral perfume probably wasn't cutting through that. You might just adopt a permanent pinch nose facial expression without even realizing it. Into this charming environment steps you along with your community. People gather in these spaces for markets, for church, for festivals, just to walk from one place to another. And unlike modern life where personal bubbles are vaguely respected, and you might queue with a bit of space between you and the next person, medieval life means proximity. Crowds were tight. Personal contact was common and unavoidable. You're pressed up against people whose own hygiene is minimal. Remember that perpetual itch from your clothes and body. And they're coughing and sneezing without covering their mouths. That refreshing gale that occasionally sweeps through isn't just blowing away the cobwebs, it's also stirring up dust laced with dried waste and aerosolized germs. You are breathing in everyone else's biohistory. It's like a historical, open-air biological warfare experiment. This dense concentration of people, coupled with a complete lack of understanding of germ theory, non-existent sanitation infrastructure, and often compromised individual health. From diet stress, poor sleep, constant labor made public spaces superspreaders. Colds would sweep through communities, turning into potentially fatal chest infections because your immune system was already battling other things. Diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water or food spread like wildfire through families and villages, killing young children and weakening adults. Skin infections easily festered. Anyone with tuberculosis or other respiratory illnesses would be coughing their way through the crowd, sharing their microbes freely with everyone in their vicinity. Your concept of social distancing wasn't a health guideline. It was just deciding if you could squeeze past someone on the narrow street. Even something as commonplace as getting a cut on your hand during fieldwork, which would happen almost daily with your manual labor, suddenly becomes potentially life-threatening. If dirt from the unsanitary environment gets an infection is highly likely. Without antibiotics, a simple infection can rapidly spread, leading to blood poisoning or gangrene. Suddenly, that small nick is a bigger problem than it would ever be for you in the modern world, where a quick wash antiseptic wipe and a Band-Aid make it a non-event. You're walking through a literal minefield of pathogens with minimal defense. Trying not to touch things becomes an impossible mission in this cluttered, bustling, dirty world. Hand sanitizer. Yeah, good luck finding that next to the overflowing cesspit. Maybe some ashes will do. Probably not. Mainstream historical fact. Due to extremely poor sanitation, close living conditions, and lack of understanding of disease transmission, towns and villages were frequently hit by endemic diseases like dysentery, influenza-like illnesses, and tuberculosis, which would spread rapidly through the population, sometimes leading to localized crises, even outside of major epidemic events like the Black Death. A quirky tidbit. In some medieval towns, pigs were actually relied upon as a sort of impromptu cleanup crew left to roam the streets and eat refuse. This sounds efficient, maybe, but obviously also added another layer of animal presence waste and potential disease vectors to the already unsavory environment. It's street cleaning by snout, I guess. You are not reassured at all. Historians still argue whether public health measures attempted in medieval towns, like setting times for waste dumping, creating local regulations against fouling water sources, or digging drainage ditches, had a measurable impact on general health compared to areas with no such rules given the limited technology understanding and inconsistent enforcement of such policies. Was a slightly regulated dump better than a free-for-all? Maybe, but the bar was so incredibly low. So, every step outside your immediate, still questionable home environment brings you into intimate contact with the collected dirt, waste, and respiratory exhalations of your community. Attending market means jostling through a crowd, inhaling the smells of uncured hides and stale food mixed with the pervasive stench of the street. Going to church means sitting or standing, packed shoulder to shoulder with neighbors listening to their hacking coughs echoing in the stone building. There's nowhere truly clean to be. The public realm is a constant, unavoidable source of potential sickness, making even a simple cold a gamble you might not win. Makes wearing a mask on the subway feel positively luxurious, doesn't it? Or perhaps make you question everything about touching public surfaces ever again, even back in your own time. You're surrounded by dirt, working constantly, feeling itchy and grimy, breathing in questionably scented air. Inevitably, you're going to get sick. Not a bit sniffly or, ow my head, sick, but proper body-altering, medieval sick. And when that happens, your option for care is likely medieval medicine. Prepare to add abject terror and dubious efficacy to your growing list of daily discomforts. Because medieval doctors bless their well-intentioned, but fundamentally ignorant hearts. Ignorant in the scientific sense, not mean sense. Often subscribe to theories about the human body and illness that now sound utterly bizarre, dangerous, and incredibly painful. You want medical treatment. It's coming, and you won't like it. The prevailing medical theory for much of the Middle Ages was the ancient Greek idea of the four humors blood phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Health was seen as a perfect balance of these humors within the body. Illness was caused by an imbalance, too much or too little of one, or perhaps in the wrong place. So logically, within their framework anyway, the cure for most ailments involved restoring that balance, often by removing excess humor. And the go-to method for removing a humor, particularly bloodletting. If you felt ill anything from a headache to a fever, the doctor, who might be a university-trained physician, if you were very wealthy, a local barber surgeon, if you were in a town or just a village wise woman, task man using herbal remedies would likely suggest you had an excess of blood. The solution: cut open a vein, often in your arm but could be elsewhere, and let a measured amount of blood drain into a bowl. They'd often use special instruments, maybe warmed first infection risk, to help the blood flow. Imagine voluntarily letting someone open a vein on your arm and just bleed onto the floor. For your health. The weaker you felt from blood loss, the more effective the treatment might have been perceived to be. They also used leeches, little blood-sucking worms applied to the skin to draw blood out. Delightful. This practice was so common it was a central part of medieval medical illustrations and continued for centuries. Feel faint and dizzy from fever. Let's remove some blood. You'll feel weaker, but probably be told that's the sickness leaving you. Oh, your body is trying to fight off infection by raising its temperature and increasing blood flow to heal. Nope, too much blood. Must get rid of it. Beyond bloodletting, there were other equally unpleasant cures rooted in humoral theory or just old beliefs. Purging involved forcing vomiting or using powerful laxatives to expel bad humors via the digestive tract. Herbal remedies were used. Some were genuinely effective based on properties we now understand, like willow bark, for pain relief. Others were useless placebo or downright poisonous. Surgical practices existed particularly for things like setting broken bones or treating external wounds, but imagine surgery without anesthesia or sterile instruments. Basic operations were agony. Any cut could become fatally infected. Amputation, if necessary, say due to gangrene spreading from an untreated infection, was brutal and carried an extremely high risk of death from shock blood loss or subsequent infection. The doctor might stop to sharpen his cutting tools mid-procedure using methods that would make a modern surgeon faint. Your paper cut from earlier suddenly seems less trivial, right? What about more internal problems? If you had, say, appendicitis, though, they didn't know what that was. Likely symptoms managed with herbs or purgatives until you either ruptured and died a painful death or miraculously survived. Mental illness was poorly understood, sometimes attributed to demonic possession or imbalances leading to horrifying treatments or institutionalization. Childhood illnesses that are now minor, like measles or whooping cough, could be fatal for many children due to lack of effective care and generally poor health. The high child mortality rate is a grim reality of medieval life. Not only might you not survive a day as an adult, your chance of surviving childhood wasn't even guaranteed. Remember the constant exposure to germs in public. Yeah, when you get hit by one, the defense mechanisms and recovery options are pretty bleak. Your primary healthcare providers are people who don't understand bacteria viruses or how your internal organs actually work. They're working on a metaphorical engine using literally wrong blueprints. A quirky tidbit about medieval remedies. Beyond humors and herbs, some cures involved rather creative or just bizarre ingredients. Medical texts suggested potions containing ground-up precious stones, believed to have magical or beneficial properties, animal excrement or body parts. There are mentions of treatments using things like powdered mummies. Yes, Egyptian mummies, which became a grisly trade, or applying poultices of unmentionable substances. You'd seriously question what was worse, the illness or the cure? Want that persistent cough to go away? Just drink this potion made from... Well, maybe don't ask. It was not like sipping modern cough syrup that tastes vaguely of cherries. Mainstream historical fact. The Black Death, arriving in the mid-14th century, devastated Europe, killing an estimated 30–60% of the population. Its impact highlighted the power of contagious diseases in a world without germ theory. Understanding and significantly challenged existing medical paradigms based on humors as doctors found themselves utterly helpless in the face of such a pandemic. This one wasn't just likely fatal. It was horrifyingly and undeniably so for a huge swathe of the population, wiping out entire communities and dramatically changing society. It's hard to last a day when the most likely cause of death involves terrifyingly rapid, unstoppable buboes. Historians still argue whether the overall decline in the severity and frequency of some epidemic diseases after the Black Death was due to a less susceptible surviving population. The adoption of some very basic public health measures spurred by the crisis, like quarantine in some port towns, albeit crudely applied, or environmental bacteriological changes over time. Regardless of the why, the medical response during the pandemic itself was almost universally ineffective from a modern perspective, relying on prayer humors, avoidance, or fleeing, none of which stopped the spread effectively. So, when you inevitably feel that tickle in your throat, that ache in your joints, or the onset of stomach cramps from bad pottage, the future doesn't hold a visit to a nice doctor's office, blood tests, and antibiotics. It holds bloodletting purgatives, perhaps a weird herbal poultice containing something unspeakable, and the very real chance that even a seemingly minor ailment will become life-threatening. Your resilience isn't just tested by hard work and dirt. It's tested by a healthcare system that could charitably be described as doing its best with no information and less effective tools, and uncharitably described as actively harmful. Get well soon. Don't count on it. And this medical reality exists against the backdrop of another ever-present, potentially fatal threat: not having enough food. So you've experienced the joyful trifecta of relentless work, rampant grime, and deeply questionable medical care. You're battered, you're aching, and frankly, you're probably feeling rather vulnerable. And layered on top of all this, like another thick, smelly, itchy garment you can't take off, is the constant gnawing worry about food. Not just the lack of variety or questionable hygiene we discussed earlier, but the sheer uncertainty of having enough food to eat, period. Famine, or at least significant hunger and scarcity, wasn't a historical anomaly to be read about in textbooks. It was a very real, very possible threat hovering over every planting, growing, and harvest season. It's difficult to survive a day when your underlying health is compromised, and you live under the perpetual threat of starving. Your world, for the vast majority, is agrarian. Your survival and the survival of your family and community hinges almost entirely on the success of the annual harvest. You plant the seeds, tend the crops, and pray. Oh, do you pray for good weather? Too much rain? Too little rain? Hail, unexpected frost, a blight hitting the wheat, pests descending in swarms. Any of these natural occurrences entirely beyond your control could decimate the crop. And if the crop fails or significantly underperforms, the ripple effect is immediate and catastrophic. Less grain means less bread, less seed, for next year less income, if you have surplus to sell and ultimately less food in bellies. There's no international grain market to fall back on, no national reserves, no government food assistance programs that magically appear. If your region's harvest fails, you face hunger, malnutrition, and potentially starvation. You hear news from nearby villages via travelers, and the first thing you ask isn't about politics. It's about the harvest. Heard anything about the rye over in Fenwick? How did their wheat do this year? This information isn't idle gossip. It's life or death intel. There were tragically periods of widespread famine in the Middle Ages caused by prolonged bad weather animal disease, wiping out livestock, or the devastating effects of conflict on farming. War meant soldiers might raid fields, steal grain, kill animals, or force you to flee, leaving crops to rot. It's not just battles that killed. Disruption of agriculture often caused far more casualties through starvation and the diseases that flourish when people are malnourished. The Great Famine of 1315-1317, for example, caused by years of exceptionally heavy rains leading to ruined harvests across northern Europe, is estimated to have killed millions, pushing desperate people to eat their seed grain or consume unhealthy or poisonous things, further weakening them. That's a mainstream historical fact you'd rather not experience firsthand. It's hard to recover from being sick when you also haven't eaten enough, and that bad pottage that maybe gave you cramps. Before or during a famine, that's a luxury. Even in good years, there's the reality of seasonal hunger, often called the hungry gap, or lean period. This is the time in late spring and early summer, just before the new crops are ready to be harvested, when last year's stores of grain, dried vegetables, and preserved foods have dwindled down or run out entirely. Food becomes scarce prices if you buy food shoot up, and meals become even more meager. You rely on whatever fresh green things you can forage and pray the harvest comes soon. Everyone loses weight during the hungry gap. It's just expected. You just try to hang on until the grain is ripe. Modern life allows us to forget entirely where our food comes from, insulated as we are by global supply chains. In medieval times, you lived it directly. Every meal was a reminder of the fragile link between your plate and the uncertain bounty of the earth. If the harvest prayers didn't work, neither did you pretty soon. Your relationship with bread moves from basic food to literally life itself. Adding to this vulnerability is the issue of storage and preservation we briefly touched on with the pottage. Without refrigeration, effective pest control, or hermetically sealed containers, storing harvested grain or preserved foods was challenging. Grain could rot in damp conditions or be devoured by rodents and insects in leaky storage pits or barns. Dried meat or fish could go bad if not salted properly or stored in unsuitable conditions. Eating contaminated or spoiled food didn't just give you a bad stomachache, it could deliver a fatal dose of bacteria or toxins. And when you're hungry, you might take risks you wouldn't otherwise. Is that piece of dried fish a little green, smelling slightly off? During the hungry gap, you might weigh the risk of potential illness against the certainty of gnawing hunger, and hunger might win the argument. Looks fine from this angle, probably just extra flavor. Nope, probably not. A quirky tidbit reflecting just how dire things could become during deep famine chronicles from periods like the Great Famine describe people resorting to eating things they wouldn't normally consider edible or healthy, such as bark from trees, roots, weeds, or even resorting to cannibalism in the absolute most desperate situations. It starkly highlights the thin line between life and death when the primary food source vanishes. Going from, do I really want to eat these leftover crusts, to, is tree bark nutritious, is a level of hunger you thankfully don't ever have to contemplate. This constant anxiety about food, this living seasonally with the threat of famine as a background hum, impacts everything. It dictates religious festivals, Thanksgiving after harvest, influences social structures, feudal dues often paid in kind. A portion of your precious grain goes to the Lord and colors your perception of wealth. Owning surplus food makes you rich and secure. The fear of starvation or even just perpetual undernourishment is a deep-seated, inescapable part of your reality. Your desire isn't for luxury foods, it's for reliable calories. For enough of that rough gray bread and watery pottage every single day, year after year. That, believe it or not, is the medieval definition of prosperity for most. Historians still argue about the exact role that famine played in population cycles alongside disease. While massive mortality events like the Black Death grab headlines, periods of chronic malnutrition due to scarcity might have weakened populations over generations, making them more susceptible to death from lesser diseases. Were these moments of acute famine entirely due to uncontrollable weather events? Or did social factors, land distribution, and ineffective manorial systems exacerbate the effects and prevent adequate preparation? The interplay between ecological disaster and human social vulnerability remains a point of scholarly debate. But for you experiencing it, it's simpler. It's about looking at the sky, worrying about the rain, feeling your stomach tighten during the hungry gap, and understanding viscerally that the full overflowing aisles of a modern supermarket are one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. You're constantly balancing the food you need to survive with the effort and risk required to produce or find it. And there's always the possibility lurking just one bad season or unexpected raid away that there won't be enough. It's hard to dream sweet dreams when your deepest subconscious worry is quite literally, will there be enough bread tomorrow? So life is tough enough, right? The gnawing worry of famine, the constant presence of grime and potential disease, the exhaustion of endless work. But wait, there's another layer of existential dread to pile on top of that. Because simply existing in a medieval society also means navigating a legal and justice system that can feel arbitrary, brutal, and disproportionately severe for what we might consider minor transgressions. Your cozy idea of modern justice, plea bargains, rehabilitation, reasonable doubt rights for the accused, toss all that out the smoky window of your house. Here, justice is swift, often public, and designed to hurt shame and deter sometimes all at once, even for relatively small offenses. And you as an average person are incredibly vulnerable to it. In theory, there are laws. Depending on where and when you are, it might be royal law, manorial law set by the Lord, or local customs that have hardened into tradition. But enforcement is patchy knowledge of rights yours specifically, which are few is limited, and the whole process is heavily skewed by social status and local power dynamics. If you break the law, or are accused of breaking the law, the consequences can be terrifying. And remember how public spaces were gross? They're also the theater for justice. Petty theft, say stealing a chicken because your family is starving during the hungry gap. Or perhaps snatching a few handfuls of grain from a field that isn't strictly yours, but whose boundaries might be confusing. These aren't treated with a warning or a small fine you can easily pay. The penalty could be incredibly harsh. Mutilation was a very real possibility. Losing a hand for repeat theft, having an ear cropped or removed, or being branded with a hot iron as a permanent mark of shame. Imagine getting caught stealing some meager food just to survive and facing the loss of the hand you rely on for all that backbreaking work that gets you the food in the first place. It's a horrifying spiral downwards. Public whipping or flogging was also common, dished out for a range of offenses from theft to cheating in the market, or simply being deemed disruptive. Getting lashed in the public square, maybe tied to the whipping post or the back of a cart, dragged through town covered in welts and humiliated while the villagers, watch, that's your Tuesday afternoon. Makes a parking ticket seem manageable. Then there are the stocks and the pillory. You've probably seen pictures or representations, usually in a slightly comical way. Let me assure you, for the person trapped in them, there was nothing comical. The stocks trap your feet, forcing you to sit on the ground, or a low bench utterly immobile for hours. The pillory traps your head and hands, forcing you to stand upright, often exposed to the sun or rain, your neck and arms aching. While you are trapped, the public can interact with you, and by interact, dirt-hard labor, and the looming threat of serious illness, treatable only by bleeding you dry. Your existence feels fragile, vulnerable, constantly under pressure from the elements, your own biology, and the needs of your body in a harsh world. But just when you thought the list of things that could drastically ruin your day was complete, let's layer on another charming aspect of medieval life, the justice system. Or rather, systems. Plural, and definitely not designed with modern concepts like due process, innocent until proven guilty, or proportionate sentencing in mind. Your small misstep could have wildly disproportionate, deeply unpleasant, and very public consequences. Forget police forces as you know them. Law enforcement was localized and often reactive. If a crime occurred, it might be the responsibility of the community, the victim, or the local lord's officials to catch the culprit. If you broke the rules within your village or on your manor, you'd likely find yourself answering to the manorial court presided over by the lord's steward. These courts dealt with all sorts of things: minor disputes between neighbors, failure to perform labor services for the lord, letting your pigs wander where they shouldn't, small thefts. Disputes over land use. Compared to modern civil and criminal courts, the manorial court was a sort of all-purpose local tribunal, swift and direct. What about the laws? They weren't written down in one accessible book you could easily reference, even if you could read, which, spoiler alert for later, you probably can't. They were a mix of custom tradition, royal decrees if they filtered down and were relevant to you and the specific rules of the manor you lived on. Ignorance of the law? Definitely not a defense. Knowing what you could and couldn't do, where you could let your animals graze, or what portions of your harvest you owed, required living it, seeing others get in trouble, and obeying authority figures who were not shy about exercising their power. Let's say, driven by that constant hunger from the hungry gap, you decided to steal a chicken from a neighbor's coop. Not exactly armed robbery, is it? In your world, that's theft, a serious offense, because that chicken isn't just a potential meal. It's capital and investment in future eggs and meat. The potential penalties for even relatively minor theft, especially repeat offenses, could be brutal. Forget a jail sentence or community service. Medieval justice often favored physical, public, and often permanent punishments. Being caught might lead to being put in the stocks or pillory in the village square for hours, exposed to public humiliation, ridicule, and maybe having rotten vegetables or worse thrown at you. While seemingly less harsh than other options, this destroyed your reputation and marked you out within your tight-knit community, potentially as ruinous as physical harm in its own way, and incredibly boring just standing there. More serious punishment could involve whipping or branding. Being publicly whipped was both painful and deeply shameful. Branding, burning a mark onto your skin with a hot iron, was literally about marking you permanently as a criminal. Forget expunging your record. You wore your crime on your skin forever. You walk past someone with a T branded on their hand, you know they're a thief. There were other forms of corporal punishment, less graphic descriptions saved, to keep things PG-13. But understand, they involved physical pain and injury. Losing an ear, having a hand cut off for, mock you, curse at you, and throw things at you. Rotting vegetables, animal dung stones. Whatever is to hand in that lovely medieval public space we just discussed. Being stuck for hours, unable to move, subjected to public scorn and physical assault by people you live with. It's a deeply humiliating and uncomfortable punishment for things like minor fraud, public drunkenness, or petty disputes. Imagine your most embarrassing moment now. Add aching limbs, hurled garbage, and the inability to escape for several hours. Yeah, definitely worse than that time you tripped in front of your crush. Even seemingly minor social infractions could draw the unwanted attention of authority. Scolding your spouse too loudly or being considered a common brawler might get you sent to the ducking stool. A chair at the end of a long beam used to repeatedly dunk offenders, often women accused of being nags or disorderly, into a river or pond. A physical punishment based entirely on perceived social nuisance, public humiliation, combined with the genuine risk of drowning or getting hypothermia depending on the weather. And who decided you were a common brawler? Often, your neighbors or local officials, influenced perhaps by grudges or personal dislike. Legal proceedings, if you even got one, weren't based on complex evidence or extensive defense. Confessions were highly prized and sometimes obtained through methods that we would consider torture or extreme duress. For much of the early Middle Ages, and in certain contexts, resolving disputes or determining guilt could involve trial by ordeal. Remember that quirk. This was the belief that God would intervene to show who was guilty. Holding a hot iron, pulling an object from boiling water. If your wound healed cleanly after a set period, you were innocent. If it festered, you were guilty. Being thrown into consecrated water. If you sank, you were innocent and likely drowned. If you floated, you were deemed guilty as the water had rejected you. Sounds incredibly fair, right? These methods were eventually replaced by things like trial by jury. But medieval juries were composed of local people who likely already knew the accused and might be influenced by rumor or reputation rather than impartiality. The death penalty was applied more frequently and for a wider range of offenses than in most modern Western legal systems. While murder was certainly punishable by death, often by hanging for commoners, beheading for nobles, so could be grand larceny theft above a certain value, arson, rebellion, or treason. Even saying something mildly critical of the king or lord could potentially be construed as such in serious instances of poaching on a lord's land. Hanging was the most common method for commoners, and the gallows was a public fixture often located outside towns as a clear warning to all who entered. The act of execution was public, a grim spectacle intended to shock and deter the assembled crowd. Imagine commuting to work and passing the gallows on your way, seeing someone hanging there. Normalizing this level of state violence, it's a different kind of heavy mental load. Mainstream historical fact. Public punishment and execution served a vital role in medieval justice, functioning as primary methods of maintaining order, deterring crime, and visually asserting the authority of the governing power, king, lord, church. A quirky tidbit benefit of clergy was a loophole where literate individuals, anyone who could read a specific passage from the Bible, could claim the right to be tried in ecclesiastical courts, which were often more lenient, particularly regarding the death penalty for non-capital offenses. This effectively meant clergy or anyone educated enough to read often got preferential treatment under the law, starkly illustrating the class and status divide in justice. Your ability to read saved your life. In our modern world, reading gives you access to information and maybe makes you better at pub quizzes. In theirs, it could quite literally be the difference between life and death on the gallows. Talk about motivation to learn your letters. Historians still argue about how frequently formal legal proceedings took place compared to informal dispute resolution within communities, or by local lords how corrupt the system was at various levels, and the degree to which royal justice effectively supplanted or coexisted with local and manorial courts over the long medieval period. Was the application of these brutal laws consistent or wildly variable depending on the local lord, the mood of the judge, or who you happen to be? Probably varied wildly, which adds another layer of terrifying unpredictability. So, as you navigate your days, you're not just worried about sickness or hunger or work. You're worried about saying or doing the wrong thing and inadvertently stepping on the wrong powerful toe or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A single accusation, whether true or false, could lead to public humiliation, painful mutilation, or even execution delivered by a system that prioritizes public order and deterrence over individual rights or nuanced guilt. It's hard to feel secure or just enjoy the minimal moments of rest when a trip to the village market might end in the stocks, or worse, simply because you spoke ill of the local bailiff or were caught picking up wood scraps from the Lord's forest. Your entire existence is tightly bound and restricted, not just by physical needs, but by a constantly enforced social hierarchy, which is our next charming stop. You've already learned the hard way that pretty much everything about your medieval existence, the food you eat, the house you live in, the work you do, even your chances of receiving harsh public punishment, is tied to who you are, or more accurately, who your parents were. This isn't a society with anything remotely resembling social mobility based on merit or hard work in the way we understand it. You were born into a social class, and with infinitesimally few exceptions, that's where you stay for your entire short, uncomfortable life. Your status defines everything about your opportunities, your rights, and your daily experience from the cradle to the grave. Welcome to the rigidly stratified world of medieval society. The structure is generally pretty straightforward. God is at the top of the divine realm, obviously. Below that are those who pray the clergy, priests, monks, nuns. Then those who fight the nobility, knights, lords, ladies, rulers. And finally, everyone else, the vast, vast majority, those who work, the peasants, laborers, townspeople, artisans. While townspeople and artisans in growing urban centers represented a slightly different dynamic and offered a tiny bit more fluidity over time, the overwhelming majority of people, especially for most of the period we're talking about, were agricultural workers tied to the land, often under the feudal system. And under feudalism, your place is largely fixed at birth. If you were born a peasant, you live as a peasant. You don't go to school. There really aren't schools for you, and even if there were, you'd be needed for labor. You don't study to become a doctor, even a barber surgeon, a lawyer, or a scribe in some distant monastery. Those paths are closed off to you by default of your birth status. Your lack of literacy and the cost and requirement of being connected to those institutions which are tied to the church or nobility. You learn the skills your parents have, farming, maybe a simple craft like basket weaving or carpentry, and you pass those skills down to your children. Your entire potential universe is pretty much contained within your village or manor and the rigid expectations placed upon your class. Your future job options are your current job options and your parents' job options. Being born into the peasantry often meant you were in some form tied to the land and to a lord. As a serf, you were not quite a slave. You couldn't be sold away from the land independently of it. But you were bound to the manor. You couldn't leave without the lord's permission. You owed him labor services on his land. Remember that boon work we discussed. Unpaid labor is a key feature, and often other dues in kind a portion of your crops or animals or in money. You lived on land owned by the lord, had very few independent rights, and were subject to his authority, his laws, the manorial court, and his demands. Your limited rights often boiled down to using certain manorial resources like the lord's mill to grind your grain, for which you paid a fee or a portion of the flour, or his oven to bake your bread again. Fee or portion paid. But often these were monopolies controlled by the lord, meaning you had to use them even if they were inconvenient or unfair. Being free from these burdens, being a free peasant, which did exist though fewer in number and their status varied, offered slightly more independence and fewer mandatory labor services, but you still lived within the same societal structure and economic realities, and you weren't suddenly climbing the social ladder. Nobility, on the other hand, inherited their titles, land, and status. They were warriors initially, although their role evolved rulers on their lands and leisured class compared to peasants. Their children might receive education focused on things like combat administration, and perhaps some literacy in Latin or French, arranged strategic marriages to other noble families to consolidate power and wealth, and spend their time on things like warfare, hunting tournaments, administering justice on their lands, and participating in courtly culture. Their lives were drastically different, defined by obligations to those higher up the feudal chain, ultimately the king, and expectations of status service and appropriate behavior. A commoner wearing clothing deemed too fine or too brightly colored might even be punished under sumptuary laws regulations designed to enforce social hierarchy visually. Your dress literally marked your class. The church offered one of the only real pathways for extremely limited social mobility, and even then it was rare for the lowest born to rise to the highest ranks. Becoming a priest or joining a monastery or convent meant leaving your previous status technically and entering an alternative hierarchy based on religious dedication and learning. But even within the church, powerful positions were often filled by people from noble families, maintaining that social stratification. And accessing literacy and education essential for clerical advancement was difficult for the majority. A mainstream historical fact that nails this point home: the vast majority of parish priests serving the common people were themselves not highly educated sometimes, barely literate in Latin, the language of Scripture, and services often coming from the peasant class themselves, but only able to serve at the lowest level, starkly contrasting with the educated clergy in cathedrals or monasteries. A quirky tidbit highlighting this class divide: the diets were significantly different. While peasants subsisted largely on grains, legumes, and ale, the nobility's diet involved much more meat from hunting on their extensive lands. A privileged activity: fish often kept in their own fish ponds, expensive spices, imported luxuries, fine white bread and wine. Another indicator of wealth and status is grapes weren't grown everywhere, and brewing was associated with commoners. Even the tableware differed drastically, from simple wooden trenchers to fine metal platters and later pottery. The physical evidence dug up by archaeologists literally shows this dietary disparity through bones and food remnants. If you found meat bones in a medieval cooking pit, they were probably nobles' leftovers, not yours. Historians still argue about the extent of social mobility within the working class. Could a successful artisan or merchant in a town accrue enough wealth and influence over generations to slowly climb towards a gentry class below the old nobility? How porous were the boundaries between free peasants and serfs? And did economic changes gradually erode the bonds of serfdom in certain regions before its more formal abolition? While limited mobility did exist, particularly with the growth of towns and trade, it was a slow, difficult process involving generations, far from the meritocratic, at least in theory, opportunities available in modern society. The crushing statistical reality was that you died in the same station you were born into. So every day is a reinforcement of your place. You work for the Lord because your family always has. You owe dues because that's the custom for your class. You interact with your neighbors who are in the same boat, facing the same hardships and expectations. You see the manor house or the knight riding past, and you know they live by entirely different rules, shielded by status. From the brute physical labor, legal vulnerability, and daily grinding poverty you experience, there is no real sense of making it weak, of fundamentally changing your circumstances through individual effort. Your best hope isn't personal advancement. It's the community scraping by, and hopefully maybe your children having things slightly less bad than you did if the harvest holds and disease spares them. But they'll still be peasants living in similar smoky houses, wearing similar itchy clothes, eating similar gruel, worried about famine and illness and brutal justice on them. So you're stuck in your social class performing backbreaking labor on land owned by someone else under a justice system that could maim you for stealing bread. Your world is pretty confined by all these realities. And you might think, well, what if I just packed up my single change of itchy clothes and my possibly cracked wooden trencher, and headed for somewhere new? Escape the manorial dues, the dusty fields, the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. Well, escaping is much, much harder than it sounds, and travel in the medieval sense is less a leisurely journey of discovery and more a perilous, exhausting ordeal you only undertake out of necessity. Because moving beyond your immediate known surroundings throws you headfirst into a fresh set of terrifying challenges. It's hard to survive a day in medieval times if your journey from point A to point B kills you. The first thing to understand is speed, or rather the utter lack of it. The vast majority of people, especially peasants, travel by foot. Your commute to the next village, even if it's only a few miles away, takes time and energy you need for work. If you're traveling further, say, to a market town, maybe a day or two's walk away, this is a significant undertaking. It requires taking time off work, often with the Lord's permission. If you're a serf, permission that might not be granted readily or freely, carrying everything you need on your back and covering perhaps 15, 25 miles in a day if you're lucky and the weather is good. That might not sound terrible, but remember, your diet minimal, possibly spoiled, and your constant physical state exhausted from labor. This isn't a hike in breathable cushioned boots on a well-marked trail. Transportation infrastructure is primitive. Roads are often little more than well-trodden paths, perhaps originally laid out by Romans centuries before, but largely unmaintained. They become quagmires of mud in wet weather and churned-up dust traps in dry periods. Bridges are few and far between. You'll often have to ford rivers or streams, potentially dangerous in fast currents or flood conditions. Forget about maps with clear directions or signs. Navigation often relies on local knowledge landmarks and asking people you meet along the way, hoping they're friendly and knowledgeable. Getting lost isn't just inconvenient. It can lead you into truly hazardous territory. The concept of road maintenance as a public service. Again, something for future generations. Roads might be improved temporarily if a king or important figure is expected to travel, but for regular folk, you get what you get, which is bumpy, uneven, and potentially treacherous. Adding to the difficulty is the risk from natural elements and wildlife. Remember how dense the forests often were, sources of wood and places to hunt for nobles. They were also home to wild animals that could be dangerous, especially if you're traveling alone or at dusk or dawn. Wolves were a real threat in many areas, particularly in harsh winters. The untamed landscape wasn't just scenery, it was potentially hostile territory. Think rustic means beautiful nature walks. No, it means genuine dangers just off the path. But the wildlife wasn't necessarily the biggest threat. Your fellow humans were often more concerning. Travel, especially with anything of value, even a sack of grain, could be value made you a target. Bandits and highwaymen preyed on travelers, especially in isolated stretches of road or near forest, which offered easy ambush points and escape routes. A successful trip meant not just reaching your destination, but doing so without being robbed, injured, or worse. Traveling in groups, if possible, offered a degree of safety, but that wasn't always practical or feasible for the average person on a necessary short journey. Your few possessions are your entire life savings effectively. Losing them isn't just a setback. It's a personal catastrophe you might not recover from. Accommodation on the road wasn't luxurious either. If you're traveling on church business, or maybe as a merchant of moderate means, you might seek hospitality at a monastery or other religious house. These often provided lodging for travelers out of charity or religious duty, but it was basic: a bed in a communal dormitory, simple food space for your horse if you had one. If you had more coin or were near a town, you might find a private inn. These inns varied greatly in quality, from simple taverns with a shared sleeping area, a barn or a room with straw for bedding, again potentially shared with strangers, and possibly infested with vermin, to slightly more comfortable private rooms for the very wealthy. Regardless, expect noise, questionable cleanliness, basic food, and the general insecurity of staying in a strange place with strangers, trusting they aren't planning to rob you overnight. Privacy, again, utterly lacking. Sleep fitful, probably interrupted by snoring, scratching, or the general commotion of a busy and probably smelly communal space. Carrying anything other than what you absolutely need for survival is impractical and dangerous. Luggage carts were for merchants or lords. Your belongings are limited to what you can physically carry. If you're taking something to sell at market, it's maybe a few chickens, a piglet, and a crate. Some eggs carefully packed, or sacks of grain, all of which make your journey slower and more exposed. Selling these goods also means returning with money, making the journey back even more dangerous. This cycle inherently limits how far you can realistically travel and for what purpose. Big trade routes existed for high-value goods carried by wealthier merchants under escort, but local travel for most people was low-value, high-risk, and physically demanding. Mainstream historical fact: many roads used in medieval Europe were originally constructed by the Romans, but had fallen into disrepair and lack of upkeep, making long-distance overland travel challenging, especially during periods of bad weather. River travel and coastal shipping were often preferred where possible, being faster and safer from highwaymen, but limited to specific routes and geographical areas. A quirky tidbit about medieval travelers: alongside merchants and pilgrims, you'd also find traveling entertainers like minstrels or jugglers, preachers, beggars, and surprisingly scholars, though very rare for lower-class folks. Scholarly life often involved traveling between nascent universities like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, across different regions, and even kingdoms, a distinctly medieval form of student life, involving walking long distances and seeking patronage or charity for lodging along the way. So while you probably wouldn't be a traveling scholar, you might occasionally encounter one looking just as grubby and road-weary as you felt. Historians still argue whether the level of risk on medieval roads from bandits and wildlife was a constant significant threat, or waxed and waned depending on regional authority. Was the local lord keeping his roads safe and overall political stability? Was fear of travel based more on common experiences and folklore, or was every journey genuinely a high-stakes gamble against human and animal dangers? It probably depended hugely on where and when you were traveling. So while the idea of running away from your dreary, demanding medieval life might cross your modern mind, the reality of medieval travel quickly squashes that notion. The difficulty of movement due to poor infrastructure, lack of transport, and constant physical fatigue, combined with the very real dangers of robbery, wild animals, and simply getting lost and succumbing to the elements, mean your world remains small. Your existence is by necessity confined to the physical area you can realistically traverse on foot, burdened within the span of a few days, without encountering something genuinely lethal. Leaving your village isn't like hopping on a train or driving away. It's a full-blown expedition fraught with peril. It means your potential life partners, trading partners, friends, and enemies are all drawn from a very limited geographical pool. Your information about the wider world comes from snippets carried by these few brave or desperate travelers. You are effectively isolated. And in that isolation, education in the way you might think of it is another luxury you don't have easy access to. You're stuck in your small, confined, difficult world, a peasant by birth, struggling through manual labor, facing hunger and illness, and acutely aware of the risks just inherent in daily life, let alone trying to travel anywhere new. Your world is defined by local routines, the demands of the manor, the seasons, and your interactions with a small pool of people. Within this existence, one of the defining factors limiting your ability to expand your horizons or improve your understanding of anything beyond your immediate tangible surroundings is the widespread lack of formal education and critically literacy. For the overwhelming majority of people in medieval Europe, the ability to read and write simply wasn't part of their life or their world. Reading? Unlikely. For you. This wasn't because people were unintelligent or incapable. It was purely a matter of societal structure, access, and need. Formal schooling as a concept available to everyone just didn't exist. Education was a privilege tied almost exclusively to the church and the nobility, and even within those groups it varied greatly. Priests and monks needed to be literate in Latin to read scripture, perform services, and copy texts. Monasteries were key centers of learning and book production by hand page, by painstaking page. Noble children, especially boys, might learn basic literacy and numeracy for estate management, law, or administration, perhaps tutored privately or sent to a church school. But their education was often practical, focused on governance, warfare, or religious knowledge relevant to their status, not necessarily broad intellectual inquiry. For you, the peasant, your education was practical, learned through doing and watching your elders. You learned how to plow the field by watching your father. You learned which herbs were edible and which were poisonous by being shown. You learned basic numbers by counting chickens or bushels of grain. You learned community customs and obligations by participating in village life and attending the likely not very sophisticated manorial court. Your skills were transmitted orally and through apprenticeship to the realities of survival, not through books or formal instruction in reading, writing, or arithmetic as a distinct subject. This form of education, while vital for daily medieval life, obviously didn't equip you for anything requiring interaction with text. Literacy was simply not a functional requirement for your day-to-day existence. The vast majority of records like manorial rolls detailing who owed what labor services were kept by literate scribes employed by the lord. Laws outside of local custom were the concern of lords and royal officials. Written communication was rare. Messages were carried by travelers, orally transmitted. There were no books readily available for personal pleasure or instruction. And even if there were, they were expensive, hand-copied, and written in Latin or perhaps Old English, French, or German that might be unintelligible to a local dialect speaker, even if read aloud. A mainstream historical fact, emphasizing this point, parchment made from animal skins was the main writing surface, incredibly expensive to produce. Ink and quills also required significant effort to make and use effectively. Producing a single book was a massive undertaking, taking months or years, making books prohibitively costly and rare. Printing presses were centuries away, a future technology you couldn't even conceive of. So reading wasn't necessary for your work, not for your social interactions, which were local and oral, not for accessing information about the world, which was limited anyway. Your main engagement with literacy was likely entirely passive, centered around the church. You might hear snippets of scripture read aloud in Latin during Mass, or maybe local laws or announcements read publicly by the bailiff. But the spoken word was primary. Storytelling sermons, village gossip, traditional songs and ballads. These were the ways information and culture were transmitted and preserved. Think of epics and romances not as books you'd curl up with, but as stories recited by a traveling minstrel at a lord's hall, which might filter down in simpler forms to village tales. Without literacy access to the wider world of ideas, recorded knowledge limited though it was by modern standards, history, philosophy, science, What little there was, again, heavily based on ancient texts and church interpretation and different perspectives, is shut off to you. Your understanding of the world is shaped entirely by your immediate environment, oral tradition, and what authority figures like the priest or the Lord choose to tell you or allow you to see. Your opportunities to learn about places you can't travel to or ideas beyond your lived experience are incredibly constrained. Your worldview is inherently local, perhaps provincial, based on rumor and personal observation, not informed by reading newspapers, non-existent pamphlets, or looking things up laughable concept. This also impacted that justice system we just discussed. While trial by jury existed, the proceedings often relied on oral testimony and the jurors' existing knowledge of the people involved. Written evidence was primarily for those who could read it, which likely excluded you and most witnesses or even lower-level local officials. And remember that quirky tidbit about benefit of clergy, allowing escape from harsh sentences just for being able to read. That single detail highlights the vast gulf created by literacy. Literacy wasn't just access to knowledge, it was a get-out-of-jail-free card, a literal measure of whether your life was worth more protection than an illiterate peasant's in the eyes of the law. Being unable to read fundamentally diminished your value and vulnerability in the medieval legal system. Imagine the frustration if you had modern awareness in this body, knowing that a few simple words could potentially save you from branding or whipping, but being physically unable to decipher them. That skill that feels as natural as breathing to you, reading words on a screen or page, was a literal superpower for maybe 5 to 10% of the population, mostly men, mostly associated with religious or noble power structures. A quirky tidbit illustrating the practical lack of writing materials. When oaths were sworn or agreements made in the presence of illiterate people, a common practice was for individuals to make their mark an X, or sometimes a simple recognizable symbol on the document next to their name, which would be written by a scribe. The mark was legally binding as their signature necessity, driving this adaptation for a non-literate society. Imagine signing off on your bank loan today with just a simple X. Well, maybe some digital signatures aren't much different these days, but the reason behind it was fundamentally different. Historians still argue about the actual rates of literacy, particularly how to measure functional literacy versus the ability to just sign one's name or read basic numbers. Was the number of people who could read perhaps higher than previously thought, even among townspeople or wealthier peasants? But they lacked the need or opportunity to read complex texts. Or was true literacy, understanding, and writing complex language really restricted to a tiny elite tied to specific professions or noble courts? It's difficult to know definitively from the scattered historical evidence, but for you, the feeling is inescapable. Your mind, your knowledge, your world are circumscribed by the limitations of not being able to access written information. Your opportunities to learn a new skill that might offer a slightly less grueling life, to understand distant events like royal decrees or international affairs beyond simplified rumor, or even just to engage with complex ideas, are severely hampered by this fundamental barrier. Your daily grind of physical labor and survival isn't mentally stimulated or broadened by engagement with the written word. And as dusk descends, extinguishing even the limited visibility afforded by day, another basic medieval reality hits hard tied partly to this lack of easy knowledge sharing, but mostly to technology or lack thereof, the terrifying power of the dark. The day is done. The sun which dictated your waking hours, your labor, and the limited visibility you had of your dirt-filled, uncomfortable world is finally gone. And with it goes most of your ability to see, move, or function effectively outside the small circle of dim light within your dwelling. This isn't like watching the sunset today and knowing the streetlights will click on, illuminating roads and paths that lamps will light up. Houses, cars will drive by with headlights piercing the dark, and electricity powers a million devices keeping you connected and secure in the artificial light of modern civilization. Medieval darkness is deep, disorienting, and inherently carries a palpable sense of threat and uncertainty that you, a modern person, are completely unequipped to handle. Your nights are about to get genuinely scary. Step outside your smoky hut once the sun has truly set. Unless there's a bright moon and it's not obscured by clouds, the world plunges into an almost absolute darkness. This isn't just inconvenient, it's profoundly disabling. Even finding your way to that designated spot for relieving yourself outside requires intense concentration and familiarity with every lump and rut in the path, stumbling over unseen obstacles, perhaps startling animals or being startled by them. There's no widespread outdoor lighting, period. Not down the lane, not on the road to the next village, not even really in the streets of a town unless a wealthy household or institution keeps a sporadic lamp lit near their own door. Trying to travel any distance after dark is madness. It's dangerous, impractical, and nobody does it unless absolutely necessary, and even then with extreme caution. Your world shrinks back down to the immediate radius you can navigate by feel or memory in the blackness, which isn't very far at all. Artificial light sources within homes were incredibly primitive and limited. The flickering fire on the hearth provided some light, but mostly just within its immediate vicinity and upward, making corners dark and shadowy. Beyond the hearth, you might have rushlights, rushes dipped in animal fat, providing a weak, smoky, and temporary light. Imagine a very dim, very smoky candle made out of a reed sputtering away. These were cheap to make, but burned down quickly. Beeswax candles were much more expensive and reserved for churches or wealthy households. Oil lamps existed fueled by animal fat or vegetable oil, but again were not efficient or widely used by the poorest and carried the risk of fire, which given your thatched roof and wooden structures was a constant threat anyway. Trying to do anything detailed or complex by these meager lights is difficult to impossible. No reading, no fine sewing, probably not even comfortable prolonged conversation once the immediate needs by the fire are done. Life slows down dramatically because you simply can't see. This profound physical darkness fed psychological darkness too. With visibility gone, the world became perceived as more dangerous, filled with unseen threats. Superstitions about night creatures, evil spirits, or even just mundane dangers like wild animals or human predators were heightened by the inability to clearly see what was around you. Every unfamiliar sound in the darkness outside, a twig snapping, an animal cry, sparks fear because your most relied upon sense sight is useless. The close proximity of people and animals within your dwelling might be comforting against the perceived dangers of the night, but it doesn't dispel the general anxiety that descends with the darkness. The line between known world and the fearful unknown feels razor thin in the black of night. Think about how jumpy you can be hearing an unexpected noise in your secure, well-lit home today. Now amplify that by 100, strip away your confidence in locks and security systems, and plunge everything into near total blackness filled with unfamiliar noises. Your relationship with night becomes entirely different. It's not a time for productivity or leisurely entertainment, unless oral storytelling by firelight counts, which it did, or simply being out and about enjoying urban nightlife non-existent. It's a time for necessary rest, huddled for safety against the encroaching, menacing dark and its perceived dangers. The idea of going out for a walk, meeting friends for a late dinner, or going to an evening event is entirely foreign. Your evening consists of finishing any absolute necessities by firelight as quickly as possible, and seeking sleep, or simply waiting out the dark hours. A mainstream historical fact emphasizing this, the medieval curfew bell or horn in some places sounding in the evening, wasn't just a quaint custom. It was a practical necessity signaling that outdoor work should stop. Fires should be damped down, literally cover fire, and people should retire to their homes largely for safety against fire risk crime facilitated by darkness and general order keeping. It's a community acknowledgement of how disabling and potentially dangerous the night was. You were expected to be off the streets. A quirky tidbit, lantern laws existed in some later medieval towns requiring householders on certain streets to hang lanterns outside their doors during the hours of darkness in winter to provide some very basic communal light, perhaps suggesting attempts to make the night marginally less treacherous in limited urban areas. Though this would have been inconsistent, and the light provided still minimal by modern standards. But it shows the perceived need for even a tiny bit more light after dark. Historians still argue about the practical impact of crime and danger after dark. While medieval laws and folklore certainly highlight fear of night crime, was the risk significantly higher compared to daytime assaults or robberies, which we already established were a travel risk. Did people actually limit movement primarily due to fear, or simply due to practical impossibility? Can't see the path. Can't see your work. It's freezing. You need to rest for dawn labor. It's likely a combination of both practical impossibility and heightened anxiety in a world without effective artificial lighting. As you settle down onto your scratchy, likely shared straw bed, the darkness is pressing in. Every creak of the house, every rustle of thatch from a mouse or a rat, another common housemate, every sound from your co-sleeping animals outside the firelight, or maybe even an inexplicable noise from further off, contributes to a sense of vulnerability. You're not ending your day scrolling through social media or reading under a bright bedside lamp. You are physically surrendering to the overwhelming unknown presence of the night. Your best defense is to lie still. Listen, hope the rough light of dawn comes quickly, and perhaps pull your threadbare blanket tighter around you. And that difficult process of seeking sleep in this environment. It's challenging, uncomfortable, and probably less restful than you need. The oppressive darkness is complete now, thick and silent, save for the unsettling creaks of your dwelling, the soft shuffling or breathing of any animals, sharing your space for warmth, and the gentle perpetual chorus of scratching, whether from you or a housemate or the inevitable pest residing in your home. Who knows, maybe a delightful mix of all three. All that's left after enduring the grueling day, the sketchy food, the bodily discomfort, and the lurking dangers of your unlit world is to try and get some rest. Sleep. That sweet escape, right? Your body screams for it after all that labor. Your mind, however, is less than optimistic because achieving anything resembling comfortable or genuinely restful sleep in medieval conditions is much like everything else a challenge in itself. You are seeking refuge in a world designed not for relaxation, but just slightly less vulnerability than being fully awake and exposed. Your bed, as we've mentioned before, isn't some plush, multi-layered mattress with soft linens and fluffy pillows. For most commoners, it's a straw pallet laid directly on the dirt floor, possibly on a low wooden frame if you're doing slightly better. The straw rustles loudly every time you shift position, which will be often. It compresses down during the night, leaving you lying pretty much on the hard, cold earth or wood below. It's also like your clothes and home, an inviting habitat for vermin. Fleas, lice, mice seeking warmth in the bedding, sharing your sleeping space with other living creatures beyond your human family or livestock is entirely par for the course. Every sudden scurrying sound or sharp itch under the covers pulls you back from the edge of slumber. Getting a full 8 hours uninterrupted by something biting you or running across your leg is a distant, aspirational concept. And speaking of sharing, sleep is a communal activity in medieval times for necessity and warmth. Your family, perhaps extended relatives or even laborers attached to the household, all huddle together in the single room. Maybe some have separate pallets. Maybe everyone piles onto a single large one, creating a tangled knot of warm, potentially twitching bodies under a few coarse blankets made of wool or rough cloth. The sheer noise from multiple people sleeping. Snoring, coughing. Remember the constant ailments and smoky air shifting. Getting up for that uncomfortable journey outside to relieve themselves, plus the animal sounds if they are nearby. This is your medieval soundscape for the night. Earbuds for noise cancellation. Definitely not in stock. You just have to somehow tune it out, or maybe you simply become so utterly exhausted from the day's labor that your body forces a level of unconsciousness despite the cacophony. Sleep becomes less about rest and more about temporary bodily shutdown. Temperature is also an issue. Your house, even with a dying fire and multiple bodies huddled together, isn't effectively insulated. Drafts snake through cracks in the walls and around the ill-fitting door. The heat from the fire dissipates as the night wears on. You'll wake up feeling the cold seep into your bones, trying to pull the inadequate covering tighter, seeking the warmth of the person sleeping next to you, or maybe wrapping a corner of that scratchy outer tunic, which you never really take off anyway, around your exposed limbs. Waking up shivering is probably a frequent experience, only alleviated by the gradual precious arrival of dawn that signals it's time to get up and get moving again. The comfort of central heating and thermal blankets belongs firmly in the distant future. Privacy, that cherished modern comfort you're likely experiencing as you listen to this, is entirely absent from your sleep. You're not retiring to your own bedroom in your own pajamas to switch off a light and be utterly alone in a dark, quiet, controlled environment. You are in direct physical proximity to everyone else, breathing the same recycled air, experiencing the same disturbances. There's no personal bubble. Even in your sleep, you are constantly aware of others. It might offer a strange sense of security against the outer darkness and its imagined perils, but it means your rest is always impinged upon by the presence and activities of those around you. It's the opposite of a quiet retreat. Imagine the noise level of a hostile dormitory, then remove earplugs and add chickens and snoring farm animals. Sweet dreams. A mainstream historical fact is that shared sleeping arrangements were incredibly common across social classes, even sometimes for non-family members like apprentices sleeping in their master's house, or travelers at an inn, and individual beds as we know them were rare. Bedding might consist of straw rags or primitive sacks for mattresses, and coarse woolen blankets, with valuable items of bedding being mentioned specifically in wills or inventories highlighting their status as assets. Your concept of personal bedding set wasn't a thing. It was a few shared items for a shared sleeping space. A quirky tidbit involves early beds for wealthier people, while more elaborate, often with curtains or canopies, partly for privacy in shared great halls. Partly for draft exclusion, they still dealt with issues like straw pallets. Some illustrations from medieval manuscripts depict wealthy individuals seemingly sleeping entirely naked, though historians debate if this was a common practice or artistic convention, and others suggest people often slept in their undertunics. So, while their beds were fancier, the comfort and habits weren't necessarily aligned with modern expectations. Maybe everyone was too itchy to keep clothes on a fun thought experiment. Historians still argue how much the quality and consistency of medieval sleep patterns were impacted by these environmental factors: cold light cycles, noise pests, versus physiological needs determined by relentless manual labor and irregular meals. Did people sleep more deeply purely from exhaustion despite the conditions, or was interrupted sleep and chronic tiredness a near universal state? It's hard to measure something as personal as sleep quality from historical records, but the physical evidence points towards sleep being challenging and uncomfortable. So your day ends not in restful quiet, but in the dim, crowded, slightly smelly reality of a medieval dwelling after dark, where comfortable, uninterrupted sleep is constantly under siege from physical discomfort, noise, cold, and crawling things. You pull your threadbare covering closer, listen to the sounds of your family and the house settling, or not settling around. You feel the persistent, subtle itch of body and clothing, and hope that maybe, just maybe, utter exhaustion will win out against all the disruptive factors and grant you a few hours of something approaching sleep before the inexorable demand of dawn and another identical difficult day arrives.